Okay, he said he would be waving frantically. Hi, everybody. Good to talk with you today. And we are talking about one of the most important issues that America faces today, and that is America's debt and the economic growth that we are looking for. We are taking a hard look at public spending and finance. Let me introduce our panel. Douglas Holtz-Eakin is President, American Action Forum, former Director, Congressional Budget Office, former Chief Economist, Council of Economic Advisors. Maya McGinnis is the President of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Stephen Ratner is the Chairman, Willett Advisors, former counselor and lead auto advisors to the U.S. Secretary of Treasury. Gene Sperling is the former Director, National Economic Council at the White House. And I don't think we could get a better group, with the exception of many of the people who were in the audience, up here today to talk about this issue. Guys, I thought we would kick it off with really talking about the state of affairs. Let's characterize the problem as you see it. Doug.
The problem has a lot of dimensions. Number one, the level of debt is high, about 75% of GDP, debt in the hands of the public, and projected to rise. I mean, you'll hear a lot about how we've got debt and deficits under control, but that's a temporary phenomenon, lasts about 2016, and then we start to see both the deficit and the debt go north inexorably. Underneath that are a whole bunch of interesting questions that I won't belabor. One, what's driving it? It's largely the mandatory spending programs, the Medicares, Medicaids, Affordable Care Acts, Social Securities, especially the health piece, and that's to the detriment to the rest of the budget. But I think the really important thing is that the high level of debt says that we in the past have not managed our finances well, and the projected explosion of the debt tells the world that they face a really inhospitable set of choices if they invest in the U.S. One possibility is that we will do the right thing, we'll get these spending programs under control, and this will be a good investment climate. No evidence of that so far. The other possibilities are we'll go straight into a third world style debt crisis, and that's not a great investment climate to be in. Or as we inch up to the point where world credit markets get nervous, we'll radically raise taxes. And that strategy will also be bad for investment purposes. So we are sending the signal to the world that the world's largest, most successful economy is not managing itself well, and that they ought to be looking for other locations. And I think that's the deepest problem that we have. And
we know that, as you just mentioned, if we continue on this path, this will only get worse. We can look at chart number one to put that up there. And you know, you sort of outlined it very clearly. But I guess let's just look at the title, the main comments on the program, and it says, with mandatory programs consuming 13.6% of GDP and rising, security spending at 5%, debt service at 1.5%, and revenue at 19%, there's really no room in the budget to fund discretionary spending at a time that we've got hot spots all around the world.
Yeah, I was trying to not steal the material from the rest of the panel, but enough of them. I mean, this is a really big. Really big problem. You know, we have these large spending programs crowding out the annual discretionary programs. They're literally getting crushed in the budget, and the current strategy is mechanically to crush them with these caps. That means that we will not be funding national security, basic research, infrastructure, education. We will not be funding the things that are genuinely investments in the future, so we're going to let the legacy programs of the past crush our future, and B, we're not going to fund the things that the founders actually recognized as the role of government. Other than that, we're good.
And that's the issue, isn't it, Maya?
No problem.
Because we talk about this issue a lot and have for many years, but when you break it down in terms of what it means, you recognize that this is actually probably one of the most serious issues we face.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what's going on right now is that people are kind of sick of the deficit and debt. It pains me to say that because I think talking about it is so fascinating. But people are tired of talking about it, and politicians are tired of talking about it. So you have kind of, there was a couple years there where people made a real effort to go after a big budget deal. It failed, and in many ways, I'll talk about this, I think we really put in place the wrong policies, and now people are trying to ignore the problem. But the situation is very bad for a number of reasons. One, there's been emphasis on the recent improvements because the short-term deficit has come down. As the president points out, it's been cut in half over the past 4 years. That's great, except for the fact that, one, that follows a huge run-up in the deficit in the 2 years before that. That was about 750%. Two, the short-term deficits weren't actually what the problem was. It's not as though the deficit this year is the real problem in the budget. It's looking forward, which is what you were just talking about, and the fact that we are on an unsustainable path. We've already borrowed so much that the problem, part of unleashing economic growth, part of a sustained recovery, part of having a budget that's flexible and able to deal with either crises or opportunities, is that you haven't locked in all these things into place. And both with our mandatory programs and our growing interest, by the way, fastest growing part of the budget. Right. I mean, that is a really silly part to be where your fastest growth is. So we have
just trying to keep up with paying for the borrowing.
Right, and that's at very low interest rates. Wait until rates go up. If interest rates go up 1 percentage point, we add about $1.2, $1.3 trillion over 10 years in interest payments. So we're incredibly vulnerable. And not only is it that the deficits come down in the short run, and that shouldn't be the focus, it still has left the debt at incredibly high rates, double what it's been historically. So that if we were to have another crisis, and if you look at CBO projections, just by the way it's done, convention, we don't build in a business cycle. We don't build in an economic downturn. But if and when there is one, and there will be one, we don't have the same kind of fiscal flexibility that we had when we had the huge, terrible crisis of 2008, because our debt levels in the low 70s are twice what they've been historically. So I feel like we've just kind of lost all the tools in the fiscal toolbox, and meanwhile have been not making smart decisions about how to allocate our budget, either kind of today or certainly going forward, where we've been definitely emphasizing consumption over investment. That's going to hurt, not help grow the economy.
Can I just emphasize one thing? I think it's a big problem in a democracy to lock in the future budgets and the way these mandatory spending programs do. It's a disservice to the next generations to not have any flexibility when they might have other problems they want to emphasize in terms of public policy making. So, that's a symptom of what's going on.
Yep.
So, look, I think that both the previous speakers have done a great job of explaining the problem from a financial, well, from a lot of points of view, but among them the amount of debt, the interest, all that stuff. Let me go back to something Maya said at the beginning of her remarks, which is more around the politics of this, which is the fact that for whatever set of reasons, it's not because you've talked about it too much, people have lost some interest in this. Actually, last year, I was sitting in Maria's chair for this panel, not doing as good a job as she does, of course, but they put us in a much bigger room. So obviously, everybody has decided this issue. No, but we got good turnout.
Well, even if you just look at market performance. Let's just look at market performance. The markets don't care about it.
The markets okay. So let me just maybe to put some flesh on this, and rather than just repeat what the previous two speakers said so well, let me just swing to a couple of slides that I think illustrate what they've been talking about. So if we go to slide 14, what slide 14 says, or what I find interesting about slide 14, and for those of you who don't follow this stuff as closely as a number of the rest of us do, it shows you what's happening to mandatory spending, the so-called entitlement programs, as well as interest that you heard people talking about. It shows you discretionary spending, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But what I find the most interesting about this is the last two lines. So you look at discretionary spending, which is essentially everything else before the so-called sequestration that occurred, and then you look at it post-sequestration. You see the ratchet down and all the things that Doug said the Founding Fathers want us to be doing. But the point about this slide that I want to make, because I'll make the other point, I think, in another slide in just a second, is if you see that little dotted line at the bottom, that little dotted line at the bottom was everything that they fought about during the government shutdown last October. All they did, or what the issue was that the sequestration was biting so deeply that both Democrats and Republicans said, we got to do something about this. But what we're going to basically do is put a little bit more money in the budget, which is what that dotted line is, and then freeze everything else for the next 2 years, put some pay-fors out there somewhere out in the outer years, and take this issue off the table. And so as we sit here today, nobody in Washington, except for probably the four of us, is really interested in talking very much about this issue, let alone doing anything. And so the tragedy of it all is, as both the previous speaker said, is that we're just going to basically be sitting here in limbo probably, at least until the next election. But let's just go to the next slide for a second, which is 15, which I think illustrates even more clearly what has happened to all kinds of other spending. And this is as a percent of GDP. And you can see that healthcare spending has risen sharply. You can see that Social Security, which used to be talked about as the problem, is a much smaller problem. And you can see that it's driven down everything else. And then just the last slide I want to just show quickly, if you go to the next slide, number 16, you can see what the consequences of that have been for federal spending on R&D and infrastructure, also as a percent of GDP, and the way they have come down sharply if you go all the way back to the 1950s.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And what you've been making, the point that all three of you made, was really where this is going and what the implications are, which I think are even more significant given the fact that one of the big cuts that we talk about so much is defense spending at a time that we do have new developments around the world. So I want to get to that. But Jean, let's talk about the priority of actually cutting the programs that everybody agrees really needs to be cut. Why do you think this has not been the priority?
It's interesting. First of all, I really do think it is important that when we have policy conversations, particularly with the public, that we actually remember what our end goals are. And I think part of the problem sometimes with deficit and debt is it starts seeming like that's the goal in itself. It's not the goal in itself. You want a combination of policies that are means to an end. That end is to have a growing economy that meets the values of our country, which is that you have a broader and stronger and more inclusive middle class, that you have an economy that allows you dignity in work and retirement with your family, and an economy where everybody has a chance to succeed. They're not condemned by the accident of their birth. That's the goal. And so you have to ask what combination of policies meet that. And I think we are, and I do believe that while there has been significant progress, hard-fought progress, which, I was part of, other people part of, but still there is an element that at the composition, it's kind of backwards.
Yeah.
So if you think about it in fiscal policy right now, what you'd probably say is, right now, it wouldn't be bad if we were injecting a little more demand into the economy because we have long-term unemployment, serious problems. This will be the first year that we're not where public policy is not contracting the economy. First year. And we've never had state-local contraction like this. So that's backwards. We should be doing a little more now. Now, on the other hand, what people really care about is those long-term charts. So what you'd want to do in a perfect policy is probably have a little bit more juice now, but not just a loan, because then people would have no confidence. But if you had a little juice at the same time, people saw, oh my God, they're going to deal with their long-term health care costs, that would be kind of the sweet spot for giving people confidence that the immediate recovery is going to be good and the United States isn't going to face a debt crisis. So instead, what you've kind of done is have enormous amount of contraction now, but you haven't really given the confidence that you're dealing with the long term. And then the third is the issue Doug raised, and it's not insignificant that we agree on this. We've been on the opposite side of, at pretty high levels of presidential campaigns, which is that those of us who are progressive, who care about deficits, care about it because it affects private investment confidence. But we don't want to crowd out private investment in the future, but you also don't want to crowd out the public investment. And so this really gets to an interesting political aspect, Maria, which is one of the reasons why people go backwards and cut down on the future spending while they are afraid to do things on revenues or entitlement spending, is because you know exactly who's going to get hit with entitlements or revenue. You know that Steve Ratner is going to pay this much more on this and a higher tax rate. You know that this person is going to get that much less from a particular entitlement. On discretionary spending, we go, there's a big pot of money. You can still support Head Start, you can still support NIH, but the truth is you can't. We're going to be at the lowest level of domestic investment since we started keeping records in 1961, so since the Eisenhower administration. And it just becomes easier to do. Well, we'll just cut another 5% of discretionary spending. And then people don't think they're taking ownership for hurting poor African-American kids or cancer research, but they are. I like to tell people, you can't be for sequestration and be for NIH. You can't. It just, you can, if you are for that level sequestration, we cannot invest more. So I think, we are backwards now, and I think that the interesting thing is that, weirdly enough, sequestration made some degree in the long-term work, which is when that was put in place, the idea was that it would be so onerous to conservatives who cared about national security and so onerous to progressives who cared about discretionary investments that it would force people back to the table to do mandatory spending and revenues. And that finally happened a bit with the Ryan-Murray agreement. And I think now people are going to have to say, if you're a Republican, wow, do I care more about never having another penny of revenue than I do about national security? And a progressive has to say, do I care more about not having another budget deal that might affect mandatory spending if not having a deal means that we're going to have such low investments in education and research, et cetera. So that's not a hopeful about this year, but I do think there is pressure put on by the existence of sequestration to make people come back to at least fight over the composition of how we're doing deficit.
You know, I wish I agreed with you about that. I wish I did, truly, because it would be great. But I'm not sure. I don't quite see it that way. I think Ryan Murray basically was a very, as I showed in that other slide, a very small compromise to deal with a few $1 billion of spending that both sides wanted to get back in the budget. And the price that we paid for that was 2 years where nothing else is likely to happen, because everybody said, okay, Ryan Murray did a deal. Isn't this great? They can work together. They can do all this stuff. It was this tiny little deal, and now we can't even get.
You and I aren't disagreeing that it was more significant for the previous fiscal year. It was less significant for this. All I'm saying is that both sides have to now reflect on this. I'm not saying that was a step forward, a small step forward, but I do think that if you are somebody who cares about national security, or if you're someone who cares about investment, you now have to ask,
what's more important?
What's more important, and how are you going to relieve that pressure unless you're willing to do some things that require compromise with the other party?
So I want to just find myself in the uncomfortable position of supporting Gene here. I think Steve's got this.
This is off the record, I hope, because he may still have a political career.
There is something known as the Non-Defense Discretionary Coalition. Just rolls off the tongue, right? Great lobbying group. But they now understand that they have to be advocates for mandatory spending reform, which is code for fixing Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And that's mechanically the kind of pressure that is going to get this done. For years, it just has been off limits. It hasn't happened. And I also want to emphasize that it's important to not talk about it as if the budget's the problem or the debt's the problem. It's past that. It's the economic performance on the ground. It's the disservice to young people today who are in a bad economy, are going to pick up the tab for this and may inherit a damaged economy if we don't do it well. And it's important for the programs themselves. People forget that Social Security, for example, stays actuarially sound on the books by promising to cut benefits 25% across the board for people in retirement 20 years from now, which is a disgraceful way to run a pension program. And so how can a country as great as this have that as their public policy? That's terrible. It should be fixed in its own right so that people can know what the deal is and they can plan for their retirements. Medicare is the same thing. Right now, money going in, money going out. The difference between payroll taxes and premiums going in and spending going out, $300 billion every year. It is the deficit problem. It's a program that will fall under its own financial weight. That's not a great service to seniors. And it delivers subpar care. So we got to fix these programs, but it's not just because of the red ink. It's because the programs themselves are not good enough for a country this great. They really need to be fixed.
Well, if this is the constant conversation about fixing the programs, why haven't we approached this? I mean, Gene's you were talking about discretionary spending, but what about the actual programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? How come we haven't seen any movements on that?
Let me say one thing, because, we have these discussions all the time. So let me throw out something which is I think a point worth us thinking, even though it has downsides, which is, you don't want to just come to panels and have people, say, or it's easy for me to say now I'm 6 weeks out. Boy, when you're in the middle of those things, I mean, the politics is brutal. It's incredibly difficult. And, for example, perfect example is we actually had a Democratic president and a Republican Speaker of the House who wanted to get an agreement. In 1997, when that happened with Clinton and Gingrich, they could do that. I don't think Barack Obama and John Boehner wanted it any less. It's just the politics.
Why? What happened? Walk us through it. Tell us how.
I think that Newt Gingrich had control over his caucus, so he could come to the table and cut a deal. And I think John Boehner didn't, and so it was hard for him to stay at the table, and it just led to lots of misunderstandings. But that's kind of like replaying the past, but let me make a more difficult point. If we put a focus on 10 years, this became, are you going to get $4 trillion? Everything got measured by what you were doing over 10 years. Now, there's a good reason to do that, which is the interest rate issue. As interest rates go back to, what their 10-year rates go back to what CBO projects at 5%, the debt becomes $680 billion by the end of the decade. So you want to tackle this so you don't get this high interest rate. On the other hand, what is the most important problem for our country is showing that in the long run, we're dealing with these difficult issues. Now, it is probably easier to get Democrats and Republicans to agree on things that don't hit right away. The success of the Reagan Tip O'Neill Social Security deal was that nobody really woke up the next morning and was being hurt. They affected the retirement age way out in the future. I think that we discourage people from coming together because that didn't give great 10-year agreements. And I say this not as a Democrat or Republican, but an observer. I say this that when I talk to Lindsey Graham or you talk to Paul Ryan, people on the other side don't agree with, want to do difficult things, they too will acknowledge that when you have to do things that affect current recipients in the next few years, it is more difficult. So perhaps we should be, instead of looking at the 10-year numbers, which often mean you're going to do an entitlement change that affects somebody a year from now, that if you say, hey, you know what? Your Medigap premiums are going to be a little higher for new recipients. Now, I'm 55. How many of us even know what they are? If you're 70, you know very well what they are, and you know you're being hurt. So perhaps to get over the political hump, perhaps we should be looking at a 20, 30-year effect as opposed to telling everybody they have to have big 10-year numbers, because those big 10-year numbers make people do very difficult things to current recipients. Maybe they should or shouldn't, but as a political reality, I think it's very difficult.
Okay, so fine. You're right. The 10-year thing is a way of measuring. It's not the only way of measuring, but part of the problem with this whole deficit thing, debt thing, is trying to figure out how to measure stuff. And I think thanks a lot to Maya's leadership, not just trying to give you a free shout out, but you deserve it. I think we've focused in on a couple of metrics to try to figure out how to measure this. One is the debt to GDP ratio and what happens to that over a period of time, as I was talking about. And then another is what you can go out 20 years, you can go out 30 years, and I agree with you that that is the right time frame in a way to look at it. But the projections become almost irrelevant when you get out there. You can't project out what the debt or deficit is going to be 20 years from now. We can't even project it out 10 years. And so the 10-year thing is a convention. But I agree with you. I think the way to think about it would be to look out beyond. But if Paul Ryan were sitting here, he would say that's exactly what his Medicare proposal says. It says that you shouldn't do anything for people who are 55 and older. You should do stuff for people who are younger. And yet, all of us on the progressive side have told Paul Ryan to go jump in a lake, basically.
No, but that's because we don't like what he's going to do in 2024.
But we have not made a proposal. We progressives have not made a proposal for what we want to do in 2024 that would be better than his, but still address the system.
Let me make this very tangible for folks. So I'll talk about the Obama budget. In the Obama budget, we do things that affect new recipients in 2017, not existing. We say that on your Medicare Part B premium, you're going to pay a little more. You're going to have cost sharing for the first time on home health. And third, Medigap is oversubsidized, and that actually makes people have more of a salad, all-you-can-eat notion, which means they spread costs. So we do all of those. So that's pretty gutsy for a Democratic president in an election year to put beneficiary changes, but they were on new beneficiaries. Now, you did not get as much grief on those because it wasn't going to hurt anybody who was existing. I'm not saying this is ideal. I'm trying to talk practically about what we should consider going forward. On the other hand, when President Obama was willing to accept the Republican offer to do the COLA change, it hit on CPI, how you measured the cost of living on programs. Even though this was something the Republican leadership was asking us to do for an agreement, once we did it, you saw both Democrats and Republicans get pretty nervous about it, a lot because they saw it was going to affect people. So look, we're an administration that was willing as part of an agreement to do that. But I'm recognizing that we're stalled and that we have to think about how to go forward. So I'm not saying this is exactly what we should do, but I am saying one of the things we should be thinking about is whether or not we aim more for things that are more politically palatable, that will have less of an impact necessarily in the next 5 years, but will affect those 20 and 30-year numbers. But remember, when you do stuff on future beneficiaries in 2018, you don't get a big score, even though you may be helping things for the next 30, 40, 50 years.
The point that you're making is one that I wish we'd been having this conversation and been able to act on it 10 years ago. Because
exactly.
Part of the problem is that we are starting to have run out of time. I mean, first, I think Doug made this point, but the economy has already been hurt by the borrowing that we've been doing for so long. Our standard of living is lower, our wages are lower, our economic growth is lower. We're already paying a price for having been fiscally irresponsible, not by borrowing, not by trillion-dollar deficits after an economic crisis, which makes sense, but by continuing to borrow during good times and not doing this where you spread out your borrowing and surpluses over a business cycle. So our economy is already worse off than it had to have been. And secondly, these changes that need to happen to the entitlement programs should have been made before the baby boom started to retire.
Right.
Because as a result of this, the fact that the only political promise that's out there is, I will not touch people over 55. That's a Republican promise, that's a Democratic promise, that's pretty much any politician's. It's not, I will protect poor children, it's not, I will protect vulnerable populations, it's, I won't touch anybody over 55. So this is a very strong group of people right now. And the fact is that for every year that we have been waiting to make these changes, which could have been very small to start, very gradually phased in, and help to strengthen the trust funds or the whole programs of Medicare and Social Security, we've run out of a lot of time. And so I'm trying to think, to the question of why we haven't been able to do this. And I think there are a couple reasons. One, we only work on these issues which are hard. Like, the reason that this isn't really a fun line of work to be in is because you're running around and telling people we're going to cut your spending, change your entitlements, and raise revenues. So nobody really likes this at all. So any excuse to delay is pretty appealing. So we only do these things when there's a crisis. That's why in 1983, when the Social Security trust funds were about to not be able to make payments, we were finally able to reform Social Security. Number two, the seniors are by far the most active lobbying group that there is. My father is usually protesting anything I say on Social Security. Like, this is not a group of people. And I think part of the reason is because people still have the sense that they've paid into these programs and they're only getting out what they've earned.
Some people do, but younger people are not expecting half of this stuff, which is why what you said 10 years ago, had we started, there's a whole group of, and an emerging group of people who are not expecting any of this.
And the other part of it is that we ended up paying much more in benefits than people did contribute. Medicare, you get $3 for every one on average, because we're living longer. And what we haven't done is sort of dealt with, how do you age more productively? How do we help make these programs protect people who depend on them but ask for more from people who don't? There are a lot of changes that could be made. And I'll just come to something that I don't think you can talk about this without avoiding, which is you need the political leadership to educate people about these programs. You need the bully pulpit to talk about not just like hashing out deals with lots of things that are unattractive, but why everybody's going to have to be part of the solution and what the benefit is, what the huge economic upside is of it. And we don't have that right now because both parties, it's not just Democrats that don't want to talk about entitlements. Republicans actually don't want to talk about entitlements very much. It's really hard stuff. They'd rather talk about repealing Obamacare than they would about real changes to health care or retirement. So we're going to have to figure out a way to have the leadership, and it's going to have to be bipartisan to kind of educate. But my main point would be, I think we ran out of time to do this as gradually as ideally we would have.
But, look, a part of this from the political perspective has to relate to just the growing polarization in the country, in the sense that you do have the two parties much further apart. There's a much bigger gulf between the group that says, I don't want to raise revenues no matter what, and the group that says, I don't want to touch certain kinds of entitlements no matter what. And it's a reflection of the fact that absolutely nothing is happening in Washington. We, those of us who care about the deficit shouldn't feel that bad that we haven't succeeded, because nobody's succeeded any issue.
Energy, nothing. That's true.
And a lot of that is the fact that the two sides, Gene made the point, which is, I think, right, and not meant to be partisan. They have a Speaker of the House who can't deliver a majority of his own party for a lot of these kinds of compromises. And you have two parties that, if you actually look at voting patterns in the House and the Senate, you'll see that compared to, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you go back to 1983 with the Social Security compromise, people crossed party lines and they got together. And today, it almost never happens. And so even if both sides say agree with probably most people who are sensible would agree with all the analysis that you've heard from us about the future and the debt and the deficit and the ratios and all this stuff. I mean, you can't disagree with it. It's just a fact. But then you get to the solutions, and everybody is just so far apart that it's become essentially impossible at this point in time to bring them together.
So I both agree with that and disagree. The facts are the facts on some of the polarization, the voting patterns things. But I think that Maya's point about leadership is absolutely crucial. And we have not seen in the past 2 presidents the kind of leadership necessary to get the big bipartisan reforms done. Neither Bush nor Obama has been the kind of president to do the public education on how big a problem these things are, and not just play the granny card every election. And neither, as a matter of their tactics, would raise their hand and say, this is a big national problem, needs to be addressed. I'm sending this legislation to the Congress and asking them to enact it. If you do that, you do Congress a big favor, because then they can go back to their constituents and say, I didn't want to do this, the president asked me to. He's the one person elected by everyone, we're going to work on this. They can also then fix that legislation. They get to claim some victories. Every chairman gets a piece of the victory. And only the White House, any White House, is situated to go to their side and say, I get it. This is a bad vote. We will take care of you. You know, you got that turtle migration bill, we're on it. And raise money for you, whatever it may be. And only the president can go to the other side and say, I know this is important to you, I'm not signing unless it's in. We just haven't seen that. That's not the mechanics of governance we've seen. So even I grant the polarization, but there is one place where the polarization is literally mechanically, our founders made sure it didn't show up, and that's in the White House. They're positioned to get over it.
How do we get over it? How do we bring people
govern differently?
Can I?
Don't leave it to Congress. Bad idea.
I think that I agree with the second part of what Doug said, and I think the first part is not actually the way the way the world works. I agree with the part that says that when you're the president, you have to particularly be able to go to your party and say, you have to do this. I'm your president. I've got this agreement. And I think, President Obama did that with some force in 2011 and 2012. I think the view that the way you get big budget agreements done is like from the movie American President, where Michael Douglas goes into the briefing room and gives like an idealistic view of the world, and then everybody says, oh, we have to do that, we're just struck by the truth, is not the case. The way things get done, historically, factually.
That's not what I said.
No, but the way it gets done is it's what Dick Darman said, everybody holds hands and jumps together. Once I was just on a panel on housing finance reform where I was explaining how the Republicans came to us and said, please don't go first. Let a bipartisan plan go first. That's exactly what happened on immigration. So what you need is so I actually think, and this is the ironic part, even though Obama and Boehner didn't get there, I actually think they were doing it right. They were, if you look at 1983, O'Neill and Reagan came together. They came out holding hands. They sold together. It was hard to oppose because it was both Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. 1990, the same with George Bush and Speaker Foley. 97, the same with Clinton and Gingrich. So I think Boehner and Obama were trying to do the right thing, which was not have the president send up his full plan, which would have made it incredibly polarization. Because I promise you, if Barack Obama sent up a plan to the United States Congress saying he was for chocolate cake would not be, there'd be a huge part of the electorate that would be against chocolate cake. So what you really do need is, even though it failed, you do need these mechanisms that bring people together in a room where they can hold hands and bring stuff together. And even though it failed this one time, it was close, very close, and it's the only model we've seen that's worked in the last 30 years.
So, I don't 100% agree with it, but the thing I 100% agree, you have to have those bipartisan deals. There's no way around it. You have to sell it very effectively, and neither of these presidents sells very well. But I still think that the first step, we need to do this. It is an important thing for our children. It is going to tangibly raise the wages of the average American. The public education, that right now, the only thing that the average American knows about a Medicare proposal is that anyone who wants to change Medicare, because everyone's been promised they get to keep Medicare as they know it, if they're changing it, it has to be ideologically driven or just evil. And we can't have that anymore. And only the president has the megaphone big enough to change that perception. That's it.
But Doug, but not to make this too partisan, that's fine. But then if you're going to do that, then you also have to make the point to people that the current revenue base cannot possibly sustain.
Make that point too. That's fine.
Well,
right?
I know, but there are a lot of people out there who make it who are demonizing just as much the idea that you would raise another dollar of revenue, even though any look at the numbers tells you that either you cut the benefits 25%, as you said, or you add some revenue. And so you've got this going on both sides.
Yeah.
No, so, I mean, I think
I was actually trying to say, I don't think Bush did this very well. Think about how Social Security reform went. Right? He said, okay, everyone gets to have a personal account. Now you, Congress, figure out how to pay for all this stuff. It was disastrous. He didn't even get a vote.
So I think what the president needs to do, I agree, it's not put out the plan. It's make it a national issue. And you can see what he's done recently on income inequality. It was really interesting watching this because he decided he was going to make this a national issue and was talking about minimum wage. And I just kept feeling like, gosh, this is so unsatisfying to have the White House talk about income inequality and then the only policy they're going to talk about is minimum wage. That doesn't do the trick. And I think what I didn't fully appreciate, and we're all seeing now, is that's how you start a national discussion. There's an editorial every single day about, well, this is one of the approaches to income inequality, or it's not income inequality, it's economic opportunity. The discussion has started. I think if the president wanted to make the debt, dealing with the long-term debt, a national priority, he just does it by making it a national discussion. Then he lets ideas come out. I think that's what would have been important. I think the other thing that I don't think he did right, it's smaller, but when it came to CPI, which was really courageous, he put this policy in his budget. It was really important that he put it there. But he sold it by saying, ugh, I'm going to do it because the Republicans want me to do it. Not saying, actually, the way we measure inflation in this country overstates inflation. Or this is one of the things that we could do that as long as we built in protection, we could protect everybody who receives benefits. So I also think he has to be the major seller of really hard policies, which he's done in a lot of ways. But in other ways, when it becomes more polarized, it's difficult. But we are where we are now. And I think one of the important points is, I think we should have done a big deal. I think a grand bargain was the way to go. I think we need to do revenues. We need to do entitlement reform. The right way to do them is all at once. But it seems like for now that's dead, and that there's not any chance of a big budget deal coming in any point soon. So the question is, are there moments where you can do small incremental changes that, again, will grow over time? So like Gene was pointing out, might not even work that much in the first decade, but will have bigger growth effects in the second decade.
Like what?
Chain CPI is actually a great example of it. There are a lot of changes to healthcare, particularly if they're only going to affect people who are coming into the programs, that will grow significantly over time. So if we can see what those savings will be in the second decade, it will help. I think it's really unfortunate. I think we're going to muddle along and do incremental changes that won't be big enough to get ahead of the problem and give this country a big boost. I think it's the best we have from the political environment for a while, though. So we need to look at for where those moments can come. And we also have to kind of emphasize how you can't deal with growth or jobs or competitiveness or economic opportunity, any of these issues, without making the fiscal piece also a part of it.
So what is the likelihood that we muddle along until a crisis happens and then the markets force change?
I think that depends a lot on what's going on in the rest of the world. The reason that we are not having markets force a crisis, which frankly we deserve in many ways, is because we're still doing better than a lot of other economies.
Well, the market, I'm sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The problem is really the markets are unlikely to force a crisis because if you look at the next 10 years, our debt to GDP ratio probably sort of hovers around the 73% level because of everything we talked about in the first part of the panel. Our immediate problem is not a debt problem. And therefore, that's why 30-year treasuries are part of why 30-year treasuries are 3.5%. The market is very quiescent about that. Our biggest problem, which I think we all agree on, most of us anyway, is the mix of spending problem and the fact that these entitlement programs are crowding out all this kind of discretionary spending that's so important to our economy. And I don't think the markets are going to be the ones who are ever going to say you got to change that. And therefore, while I agree with the sort of thrust of your question, Maria, that I personally think it may well take a crisis for this to sort of erupt, it's not going to be the markets that are going to create a crisis over the mix of spending problem that we have.
Well, we also have, let's talk foreign policy for a moment, because we have issues around the world, like what's happening in Russia. Is now the time to be cutting defense spending, which is, of course, one of the levers that constantly comes up as we look to cut back spending?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to recognize that when you cut the Pentagon's budget, the Pentagon's budget has all the same problems the federal budget has, just writ smaller. It's got a big retirement problem. It's got a big healthcare problem. And so some of those cuts aren't necessarily going to have to come out of military readiness. As it's turned out, we've got it backwards again. The priority has been to preserve those benefits, try touching TRICARE for life or something like that. And instead, they're coming out of readiness. So, at the Pentagon level, got to do the same thing, which is do a serious pension reform, long overdue. They're working on it. Get some serious reforms to the healthcare programs, and that gives you the room to maintain within the current budget, not have to cut so much, and deliver readiness that matches the threats we face. And it's not a world that's getting safer, and so we do have to take this on.
It's unfortunate that so many important decisions in terms of how we allocate capital as a country are sort of laced with politics. I don't know the answer to that. You've been in the room, Jean. I mean, what do you do in terms of shaking that off and getting real solutions and not have them politically based?
I have a thought which is very unsatisfactory, but it seems to me that we're going to have to start outsourcing the hard choices. And I think about something like Simpson-Bowles, which was a commission which came up with what I and many people thought was a very, very sensible plan. But one of the beauties of it is that if they had passed something like that, nobody would have had to own it. Well, you were saying that if the president gave the idea, but I think it's even better if you have an outside commission. And you're like, well, this part I hate, and this is not what I believe, but this was what we were given, so we're kind of outsourcing those hard choices, and it protects politicians from making them. I think another thing, I'm sure it's controversial on this panel, but I'm a big fan of the structure of IPAB, which is something where when healthcare costs are growing faster than they're supposed to be, outside experts would come up with solutions. I think you should actually expand the kinds of cuts and reforms that they could make. And then members of Congress would either agree or disagree to implement them. But I think the bottom line is politicians like to cut taxes and raise spending. That's what they like to do. And what we need to do is talk about doing the opposite. So I think we're going to have a lot more technical panels, commissions, expert groups that then members of Congress kind of say, well, we know it needs to get done, so we'll adopt that. It's not really democracy, so I'm not sure it's a very good answer. Hopefully there's better ideas.
What was the first commission, first presidential commission?
This president or ever?
Ever?
Gosh, I don't know.
Which president?
I don't know.
What's
George
the answer,
Washington.
Doug?
George Washington.
Did it work?
He put together a commission to stop what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. History will show he had to send in the troops. Commissions don't work. Forget it.
Well, why not?
All right, what's your answer? What do you think we should do?
It's part of democracy. Wait a minute.
What about the base closing commission?
Aha.
The base closing commission stands as an exception, but that was one. That's not a presidential commission. That's Congress developing special rules to deal with problems, and I'm a big fan of that. But I think the larger point that I would make, and I'll just stop, is it's a democracy. Politics should be in it. I mean, we're governing ourselves, and yes. And it is the job of people like me and the folks on this panel to make good policy, good politics. My staff's always got terribly frustrated at the White House. They'd say, "Oh my God, what are you guys doing? This is such a bad idea."
If our job is to make good policy, good politics, we are not doing very well.
I don't disagree with that. I'm a lifetime failure, but I mean, but I don't think you solve the problem by pretending there won't be politics. That's a mistake.
Gene?
So two things. I think that putting the commission aside, I think what Maya's saying, I think Doug's not disagreeing, is that there are times where you should realize that, if Congress has difficulty or something so technical. I can remember being at the table with Eric Cantor during the Biden group as we went through the unbelievable complex Medicare savings and thinking how much both of us were cramming, like, college students to sound smart at the table. So, I think if you can put in place things that are sensible ways where it just, Congress politics decide this is something that might be better for discretion of experts, that's probably, and puts a bit of, automatic nature in it. I think that is good to look for. I think the biggest problem, and it disagrees a little bit with something Maya said, is I think the biggest problem is just people, it sounds simple, people just don't want to compromise. So I actually disagree when she said, well, the president should have said, I love the cost of living adjustment. I think him saying, I don't like this, but I'm willing to agree to it to move the country forward is exactly what's missing. I'm not looking for Republicans to say, I've decided I'm for revenue. Look what Coburn says. Coburn says, I would do this all with spending cuts. That's what I believe. But I live in a democracy. I talk to men and women of honor who disagree with me. And if I'm going to move the country forward, you do that. Do you think in 1997, Bill Clinton decided he was for lowering the capital gains tax cut? No. Do you think Newt Gingrich decided after they had beat health care that they were going to let Clinton get like the new children's health, the CHIP program? No, they didn't decide. They decided that it was better for the country to compromise. And if we could do that right now, that's what would move us forward. And I think that is the problem with the politics, Maria, is that people just are losing the ability to say, I hate that idea, but I'm going to go along with it because we're a divided country and it's democracy and we have to move the country forward. And they can go back to their folks and say, it's not that the president made me do it. It's just, we have to compromise to move forward. And I think there's still a lot of people in the American public who think people should work together here.
I feel like there was a different environment years ago that people did work together.
It was. Look, it was a different environment. As I said, if you look at, we don't have a chart on this, unfortunately, because I've seen some really cool charts on it. But if you look back in history, you will find that Democrats and Republicans, cross-party lines, voted by large majorities often until the last 10, 15 years. And it's just gotten, and now it literally almost never happens. And so you have to, you have to accept the idea, which I do, maybe not everybody does, that at the moment the system is broken. Maya talked about how the president had raised the notion of the minimum wage in people's consciousness. And he got a whole bunch of states to go ahead and raise their minimum wage. What's happened in Washington? Nothing. We've had, Gene would know the exact number, but we've had a huge number of people who lost their extended unemployment benefits at the end of last year when that program expired. They've been arguing about it. It's now, what, April 26th or 7th, whatever it is, 25th. They've been arguing about it ever since. They may have a compromise. They may not have a compromise. But meanwhile, all these people have lost their benefits, which I think any reasonable person would say in an economy of 6.5% shouldn't happen. The last Congress passed fewer than half as many laws as any Congress in modern history. Some of you may say, well, that's a great thing. We don't want to pass laws anyway. I think what we're saying is we actually think there are some things they should be doing. So you can't disagree about where we are now. The question you have to ask yourself is can it get better? Will it get better? Is there a way to get it better? And I don't know the answer to that question, but my instinct is closer to where Maya is in the sense that I think we may have to think about other mechanisms for bridging these gaps, just like the base closing commissions, whether it was, which was a congressional creation, or just like fast track on trade when we have it, which we don't have at the moment, another problem with Congress. But we may need to find some other mechanisms to help Congress and the president over these really tough issues.
Or some kind of an incentive to work together.
So I'm 100% agreeing with Gene. I think the whole notion that principled compromise is now perceived as surrender is a fundamental problem, and there's no way around that. But I'm always hopeful. I'm an optimist by nature, and we're starting to see some changes in the environment. I mean, certainly the Just Say No caucus in the House of Representatives, my people, John Boehner basically said to them, you want to touch that stove? Fine, put your face on the stove, see what happens. And they got pounded, and it was a terrifically bad thing for the country and a terribly bad thing for them. And what came out of it was Ryan Murray, no one's idea of a big budget deal, but something that had the architecture that was right, changed mandatory spending to preserve some discretionary spending, was full of gimmicks. It's not nearly as tough as anyone would like, but that was a turning of the corner, right? This is a group that came to Washington to say no. They did it very effectively, and they found out that's not the only thing you can do. And that, to me, means that there's a little bit of a change in the way at least the Congress is operating, and hopefully, given the pressing nature of the problems we face, there will be a larger change in the years to come in both the administration and the congressional behavior.
What are the most important things to do? We're not going to really see anything done this year, I assume, ahead of the midterm elections. But what are the most important in terms of priority, tools or actions that can be taken beginning in the next couple of years to actually get our arms around this? Gene?
Just so, I just want to get a couple of things in that are not the normal conversation, because it is worth recognizing that the Congressional Budget Office estimates that if the immigration reform bill were to pass, if we were to make millions of people taxpayers who are not taxpayers now, bring in the more productivity, more talented workers, et cetera, that would raise about $900 billion in deficit reduction in the next 20 years. That doesn't solve everything, but that is a place you've had bipartisanship in the United States Senate. The second thing I want to mention is it's very unfortunate the politicization of healthcare is not helpful now. One thing that's just absolutely striking is that healthcare per cost growth is at a historic low. It was 4.5% above inflation over time. It was 3.9% in up till 2007. When it went really low, everybody said, well, that must just be the recession. But now, in the 2010 to 2013, you still have the lowest inflation and the lowest cost per person in healthcare that we've had. And it's kind of interesting. Nobody wants to look seriously at why that is. Some people want to say that the ACA deserves all the credit for it. Other people don't want to acknowledge it because they're worried the ACA would get credit for it. A lot of people are worried that if that looks true, it will take the pressure off to do difficult things. But we as a country should be at least asking why this is happening, because if we just through improving how we do health care could bring down what Medicare and Medicaid are growing per year, which they are now, and were it to last, it would be pretty meaningful. So I know everybody must be trying to figure out what I'm reading into that. Am I trying to support the ACA or take away pressure from Medicare cuts? No, I'm not saying any of those things. I think it's far too uncertain. But boy, oh boy, when you have something this dramatic happening, you would think that people would be taking a close look. And I think everybody is so worried that anything on healthcare can only be thought of in the context of the ACA fight that we're missing something that could be dramatic. And we should be trying to figure out, not with political blinders on, but you should be figuring out what is going on in healthcare, and are there things happening in the delivery system, in value over volume, in more consumer skin in the game, in more comprehensive coverage, whatever it is. We should be looking at what's going on, because those are two things that maybe people could come together on.
I'll give you 4 specific things that I think should happen after the midterms. Nothing's going to happen before, except possibly a lot of things that will make the situation worse. And this is all short of the grand bargain, which, again, I still think is the only way that really lends political cover for this to work. But let's say we have to do this in steps. I think one is tax reform. I think what Chairman Camp put out was a really good starting point. So we do need to do the kinds of tax reform. Speaking of backwards things that we've done so far, Gene was talking about how everything we've done has been kind of upside down. And when I look at the policies that we've done that have generated savings, we got savings from discretionary spending, not mandatory, backwards. And we got revenues from tax rates, not tax reform, backwards. So I would say looking at tax reform, which broadens the base, this is both on the business and individual side, lowers the rates, and brings in revenues for deficit reduction would be one important objective. Number 2, I would deal with Social Security completely separately from the budget issue. Quite honestly, it doesn't make a difference in terms of the financial and fiscal impact, but politically you just have to separate these things and deal with a very different effort to do Social Security reform on its own. 3, in terms of health care, either we put in a bunch of small things that generate savings, certainly what Gene is saying, which is if these savings prove to be coming from things from the healthcare reforms, let's do more of them, let's study it. This is a place where data plays an incredibly important role. But I'm also interested in the idea of having an overall healthcare budget. Remember, 2/3 of our budget isn't actually a budget. There's no cap on it. You don't set any cap on how much you're going to spend. Discretionary spending we keep squeezing down. Mandatory spending is just on automatic pilot. I'd put an actual budget or limit on healthcare spending, and when it's growing X% faster than the economy, which, by the way, is already unsustainable when something's growing indefinitely faster than the economy, I would use that to pressure us to come up with more healthcare savings. And then finally, I do think we have to look at all the squeezing out that's going on in public investment. It's not just as the result of the sequester. It's been going on for years and decades because of the squeezing out of the budget of public investments. So I think we need to find real ways to swap out the consumption spending, do more on investment spending. If you did those 4 things, we would be very, very far along.
So I want to pick 2 of those to emphasize. Gene's on immigration, I think, is a really good point. We've had a number of very difficult national discussions about immigration reform. 2007, 2008 was quite painful for me personally. The McCain campaign went broke when John McCain stood on a stage with Ted Kennedy and pledged to do comprehensive immigration reform. We went from first to last and broke by July 3rd of 2007, and that was at the heart of it, was a discontent about that. This time around, we've had a much better conversation. We're not over the finish line, and this is a hard issue for lots of reasons, but it would have dramatic economic benefits. It is one of the most powerful and underused potential tools of economic policy. The native-born population in the U.S. has sub-replacement fertility. We're not having enough kids. That means all of our future labor force, its skills, its entrepreneurial talents, its aspirations come from our decisions about immigration. We could do remarkable things. And so I'd love to see that get over the finish line fast. I wouldn't rule it out this year. It's going to be tough, but certainly in the near future. And then second, Social Security. This is mechanically the easiest thing to fix. I mean, it's a very simple program. And in keeping with the, maybe you need a crisis to get something done, while the retirement trust fund is still there, the disability trust fund is going to go bankrupt in a couple of years. I forget what we're down to now. 16?
Yeah.
It's pressing.
Soon.
It's pressing. So let's have that conversation, get something done, use that as momentum to take on the larger problem.
Steve, do you have any sort of tools or most important in terms of your priority that needs to be done in the coming years to really get our arms around this?
Look, in a perfect world, I'd love to do exactly the four, or some flavor of the four things of devils in the details that Maya listed. She ticked off what are clearly the four things, the four areas that if we could focus on them, we could make some huge improvement in these problems. But I hate to be the total voice of gloom and pessimism on this panel, but I'm just not optimistic about this happening, not just this year. I'm even not particularly optimistic about it happening before the next presidential election. I think the country has to speak in a presidential, may have to speak in a presidential election again, give one side or the other some mandate based on some set of policies or some set of goals that they set forth. Hopefully get, whoever that president is, get a mandate in terms of a Congress that is supportive of doing whatever it is the country is voting for, and then get on with it. But I worry that for the next 2.5 years, we're going to essentially sit in some form of this limbo, with the possible exception of immigration. For all the reasons everybody else has said, I won't repeat why it's a good thing. And then, of course, very interestingly, for those of you who didn't notice it, Boehner's speech at the end of last week out in Ohio, where he seemed to be presenting another put your face to the stove moment for his caucus. So I can be a little bit optimistic about immigration, and I wish I could be more optimistic about everything else.
Well, I don't think that we solved the world's problems on this panel today, but let me just tick off some of the things that are important to this esteemed group, and that is, of course, immigration reform. The $900 billion in tax revenue that could be brought in is an important point.
Over 20 years.
Over 20 years. Improving how we do health care, improving and making sure, acknowledging the cost savings already. Tax reform, Social Security, Maya, you think we deal with that separately. And of course, focus on that squeezing out of public investment. Did I miss anything?
Good job.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies. And thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this session.